book of Job, we really don't know its date. It's probably no earlier than the 6th century BCE, but scholars disagree, and there are portions of it that seem to reflect a very old and ancient, very ancient tradition. It's one of the hardest books of the Bible for moderns to read, and I think that's because its conclusions, to the degree that we can agree on what the conclusions might be, but its conclusions seem to fly in the face of some basic religious convictions. You have to allow yourself, I think, to be surprised, to open your mind, to allow yourself to take Job's charges against God seriously. After all, the narrator makes it clear that God does take them seriously. God nowhere denies Job's charges, and in fact, at one point, the narrator has God say that Job has spoken truly. So no matter how uncomfortable Job may make you feel, you need to understand his claims and not condemn him. Job is going to attack the optimistic conventional piety that is typified in the book of Proverbs. He's going to challenge the assumption that there is a moral world order. The issues that are raised in this book are twofold. First, why God permits blatant injustice and undeserved suffering and evil to exist in the world. And second of all, whether people will be virtuous when they are afflicted and suffering. In other words, are people righteous only because God will reward them for it, or are they righteous because of the intrinsic and inherent value of righteousness? Those are the two issues. The name Job, which in Hebrew is pronounced Eov, is sort of bivalent in meaning. It can mean enemy in Hebrew by changing vowels around, but it's the root is the root for enemy, oyev. Or if we take it in Aramaic, it can mean one who repents, a repentant one. And as we're going to see, the name will be appropriate in both senses as the story progresses. The story opens by introducing us to Job. He's said to be a blameless and upright man. He fears God and he shuns evil. That is chapter 1, verse 1. So the moral virtue and innocence of Job is established in the opening line as a narrative fact, a non-negotiable narrative fact. And yet this Job is to become the victim of a challenge issued by the Satan in the heavenly council. I say the Satan deliberately, the Satan. The Satan is certainly not the devil. There's no such notion in the Hebrew Bible. The phrase the Satan occurs 4 times in the Hebrew Bible. Here and in Numbers 22 and in Zechariah 3, the Satan is simply a member of the divine council, one of God's minions whose function it is to investigate affairs on earth and to act as a kind of prosecuting attorney. He has to bring evildoers to justice. And it's only in later Jewish and especially Christian thought that the term loses the definite article from the Satan, which means the prosecutor essentially, the prosecuting attorney, and becomes a proper name, capital S, Satan, for an enemy or opponent of God. This later concept of Satan develops as a means of explaining evil without attributing it to God. But that isn't the function of the Satan here. He works for God. And when Yahweh boasts of his pious servant Job, the prosecuting angel wonders, as his portfolio requires him to do, whether Job's piety is sincere. Perhaps he's motivated by self-interest. Since he's been blessed with such good fortune and prosperity, he's naturally enough pious and righteous, but would his piety survive affliction and suffering? Deprived of his wealth, wouldn't he curse God to his face? And you have to notice as you're reading that the euphemistic use of bless God instead of curse God. Ancient writers did not want to write down curse God, so they wrote bless God, but we need to understand that's a euphemistic way of avoiding writing curse God. So wouldn't he curse God to his face? And God is quite confident that Job's piety is not superficial, it's not driven by the desire for reward, and so he permits the Satan to put Job to the test. Job's children are killed. His cattle are destroyed, his property is destroyed. But Job's response in chapter 1, verse 21 is, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. God gives, and God takes away. May the name of the Lord be blessed. And the narrator then adds in verse 22, in all this, and if you flip over, I've got some of these key verses on the back of your handout to help you keep track, but in all this, Job did not sin or impute anything unsavory to God. God again praises Job to the Satan, saying, and still he holds on to his integrity, so you incited me to destroy him for nothing. That's chapter 2, verse 3. So the Satan proposes increasing the suffering, and God agrees on the condition that Job's life be preserved. So the Satan strikes Job's body with these terrible, painful sores, trying to crush his spirit. And Job's wife rages, do you still hold on to your integrity? bless God, curse God, and die, chapter 2, verse 9. But still, Job will not sin. He will not curse God. He insists on remaining virtuous, and he responds, shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? So at first glance, it would appear that Job accepts his bitter fate. But note, after the first round of suffering, the narrator observed that in all this Job did not sin with his lips or impute anything unsavory to God. But now he merely observes, in all this Job did not sin with his lips. Not with his lips, perhaps, but in his heart did he impute unsavory things to God. And if we were to move directly to the conclusion of the folktale in chapter 42, if we jump from this point just to the conclusion in 42, verse 7 is where the conclusion begins, we would find that Job is rewarded fully for his patience and his steadfast loyalty, and his household and his belongings are restored to him twice over. The folktale standing alone could be read as the story of an innocent man tested who accepts his fate, he retains his faith, and he's rewarded. Standing alone, the tale appears to reflect the values and the conventional piety of the wisdom literature and of the Deuteronomistic school. But the folktale doesn't stand alone. The anonymous author of Job uses this earlier legend concerning the righteous man Job as a frame for his own purposes. And the hint at the end of the prologue that Job perhaps is beginning to impute unsavory things to God points forward to this extensive poetic dialogue that's following. And here are Job's unsavory accusations against God. Here we have a most impatient and furious Job who will charge God with gross mismanagement of the world and eventually deny the existence of a moral order altogether. So reading the book of Job is a fascinating exercise because the two types of material in the book, the prose frame and the poetic dialogue in the middle, they appear to be in tension. And yet, interwoven as they are now, they work together, and the one shapes our reading of the other. Our reception of the accusations of Job's friends in the poetic dialogue, our reception of those words is determined by the prose framework's assertion that Job is innocent. That's a non-negotiable narrative fact. And because of that fact of Job's righteousness, we know Job's friends are lying when they say Job must be suffering for some hidden sin. And we know that Job's self-defense, that he hasn't deserved the suffering, is correct. We're going to rehearse some of the arguments that are advanced in the central core, the poetic core of the book. And here, I think, a helpful guide through the arguments. There are lots of commentaries on the book of Job, but one commentary that I think is helpful in just sort of working through some of the arguments of the interlocutors is the analysis of Edwin Good. Although Job doesn't exactly curse God in his first speech, he does curse the day of his birth. And in a passage that alludes repeatedly to creation, Job essentially curses all that God has accomplished as creator of the cosmos. He wishes he were dead, and at this point, he doesn't even ask why this has happened to him. He only asks why he should be alive when he prefers death. And Eliphaz's reply is long and elaborate, and he seems to offer comfort. He seems to offer comfort until he injects a new element in the discussion, and that's the element of justice. Job hasn't mentioned the issue of justice at this point, but Eliphaz says, "Think now, what innocent man ever perished? Where have the upright been destroyed? As I have seen, those who plow evil and sow mischief reap them." Chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. So Eliphaz is handing Job the standard line of biblical wisdom literature as exemplified by something like the book of Proverbs, belief in a system of divine retributive justice, right? That retribution is just. By definition, there can be no undeserved suffering. The implication is that Job has deserved this suffering, a thought that apparently hadn't occurred to Job. And the question of undeserved suffering is now going to dominate the rest of the discussion. And Job's second speech is very disorderly. It's full of wild, contradictory images that may reflect the shock and the pain and the rage that now overwhelm him. He seems to be haunted by Eliphaz's connection of his suffering with some sin. And so he turns to address God directly. He admits he's not perfect, but surely, he objects, he doesn't deserve such affliction. In chapter 8, we have Bildad's speech, and it's tactless and unkind. He says, "Will God pervert the right? Will the Almighty pervert justice? If your sons sinned against him, he dispatched them for their transgressions." In other words, God is perfectly just, and ultimately, all get what they deserve. Indeed, your children, Job, must have died because they sinned. So just search for God and ask for mercy. The friends' speeches lead Job to the conclusion that God must be indifferent to moral status. God doesn't follow the rules that he demands of human beings. It's chapter 9, verse 22. He finishes off both perfect and wicked. When Job complains, he wounds me much for nothing, chapter 9, verse 17, he's echoing God's own words to the Satan in the prologue. Remember when God says to the Satan, you have incited me to destroy him for nothing. And we suspect by this verbal coincidence that Job is right. Legal terms dominate as Job calls for the charges against him to be published, and then he hurls countercharges in a suit against God. Charges of unworthy conduct, of spurning his creatures while smiling on the wicked, on scrutinizing Job even though he knows Job to be innocent. And this too is a subversion of a common prophetic literary genre that we've seen, right? The Reeve or the Covenant lawsuit, in which God, through his prophets, charges Israel with flagrant violation of the terms of the covenant and warns of inevitable punishment. Here in Job, it's a man who arraigns God. And yet, Job asserts, since God is God and not a human adversary, there's really no fair way for the lawsuit between them to be tried or arbitrated. Man cannot win a suit against God, chapter 9, verse 2. Job is powerless in the face of this injustice. These ideas all find expression in Job 10, verses 1 through 7. I am disgusted with life. I will give rein to my complaint, speak in the bitterness of my soul. I say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know what you charge me with. Does it benefit you to defraud, to despise the toil of your hands while smiling on the counsel of the wicked? Do you have the eyes of flesh? Is your vision that of mere man? Are your days the days of a mortal? Are your years the years of a man, that you seek my iniquity and search out my sin? You know that I am not guilty, and that there is none to deliver from your hand. Job repeats his wish to die, this time less because of the suffering and more because his worldview has collapsed. He sees that divine power is utterly divorced from justice. And that's a second fundamental biblical assumption subverted. But Job's words only seem to egg his interlocutors on. Eliphaz had implied that Job was a sinner. Bildad had baldly asserted that his sons had died for their sins. And now Zophar is going to claim that actually Job is suffering less than he deserves. And Job isn't persuaded. He isn't persuaded that he has sinned, or more precisely, that he has sinned in proportion to the punishment he is now suffering. God is simply unjust. The Job of this poetic dialogue portion of the book is hardly patient or pious. He is angry, he's violent, he argues, he complains, and he vehemently insists upon his innocence. In the fourth speech by Job, now this is the speech that opens the second cycle of speeches, Job appeals to creation. God's controlling power is arbitrary and unprincipled. He interferes with the natural order, he interferes with the human order, and this is itself a subversion of the Genesis portrait of creation as a process whose goal and crown is humankind. Again, Job demands a trial. He demands a trial in the widely quoted and mistranslated verse. This is Job 13, verse 15. He may well slay me. I have no hope, but I must argue my case before him. In other words, Job knows that he can't win, but he still wants his day in court. He wants to make his accusation of God's mismanagement. He wants to voice his protest, even though he knows it will gain him nothing. And in a pun on his name, Eov, Job asks God, why do you hide your face and treat me like an enemy? Treat me like an oyev. 13, verse 28. In his second speech, Job fully expects to be murdered, not executed, but murdered by God, and hopes only that the evidence of his murder will not be concealed. He says in 16, verse 18, earth, do not cover my blood. And Job's third speech reiterates this desire, the desire that the wrong against him not be forgotten. Would that my words were written, would that they were engraved in an inscription with an iron stylus and lead, forever in rock they were incised. Chapter 19, verses 23 to 24. Job's three speeches in the second cycle become increasingly emotional, and for their part, the speeches of his friends in this cycle become increasingly cruel. Their insistence that suffering is always a sure sign of sin seems to justify hostility towards and contempt for Job. He's now depicted as universally mocked and humiliated and despised and abused. And one cannot help but see in this characterization of Job's friends, so-called friends, an incisive commentary on the callous human propensity to blame the victim, and to do so lest our tidy and comfortable picture of a moral universe in which the righteous do not suffer should come apart at the seams, as Job's has. Job opens the third cycle of speeches, urging his friends to look, to really see his situation, because if they did, they would be appalled. Job's situation, looked at honestly, requires the admission that God has done this for no reason and that the friend's understanding of the world is a lie. Job asserts baldly, there is no distributive justice, there's no coherent or orderly system of morality in this life or any other. There is no principle of afterlife, after all, in the Hebrew Bible. Chapter 21, verses 7 through 26. Why do the wicked live on, prosper, and grow wealthy? Their children are with them always, and they see their children's children. Their homes are secure, without fear. They do not feel the rod of God. Their children skip about. They sing to the music of timbrel and lute and revel to the tune of the pipe. They spend their days in happiness and go down to Sheol in peace. How seldom does the lamp of the wicked fail? Does the calamity they deserve befall them? You say God is reserving his punishment for his sons. Let it be paid back to him, that he may feel it. One man dies in robust health, all tranquil and untroubled. His pails are full of milk. The marrow of his bones is juicy. Another dies, embittered, never having tasted happiness. They both lie in the dust and are covered with worms. But the friends can't look honestly at Job. They can't allow that indeed a righteous man suffers horribly. By the end of the third cycle, Job is ready and eager for his trial, but he can't find God. Job's final speech in the third cycle focuses on this theme of divine absence. God is irresponsibly absent from the world, and the result is human wickedness. So from the idea that God is morally neutral or indifferent, Job has moved to the implicit charge that God is responsible for wickedness. He rewards wickedness. He causes wickedness. By his absence, his failure to govern properly, he is both corrupt and a corrupter of others. If it is not so, he says, who will prove me a liar and bring my words to naught? And yet, even in the depths of his anguish, and even though he is now convinced that God does not enforce a moral law in the universe, Job clings to one value. Righteousness is a virtue in and of itself, and even if it brings no reward, Job will not give up his righteousness. Face to face with the shocking insight that good and evil are met with indifference by God, that righteousness brings no reward and wickedness no punishment, Job, although bitter, refuses to succumb to a moral nihilism. Chapter 26, verses 2 through 6. By God who has deprived me of justice, by Shaddai who has embittered my life, as long as there is life in me, and God's breath is in my nostrils, my lips will speak no wrong, nor my tongue utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Until I die, I will maintain my integrity. I persist in my righteousness and will not yield. I shall be free of reproach as long as I live. And these last lines recall the words of God and the Satan in the prelude. The Satan had said that a man will not hold on to virtue or to righteousness in the face of suffering. He'll give everything away for his life. So this narrative setup guides or influences our interpretation of Job's statement here. Although he is losing his life, Job says he will not give anything away, but he holds on to, he maintains his integrity, just as God had scolded the Satan in chapter 2, verse 3, which reads, still he holds on to his integrity. You have incited me to destroy him for nothing. So in his darkest, most bitter hour, with all hope of reward gone, Job clings to the one thing he has, his own righteousness. In fact, when all hope of a just reward is gone, then righteousness becomes an intrinsic value. Yechezkel Kaufman writes of this moment, the poet raises Job to the bleak summit of righteousness, bereft of hope, bereft of faith in divine justice. Or in the words of another scholar, Moshe Greenberg, we see here the sheer heroism of a naked man forsaken by his God and his friends and bereft of a clue to understand his suffering, still maintaining faith in the value of his virtue and in the absolute duty of man to be virtuous. The universe has turned its back on him. We may add he believes God has turned his back on him, yet Job persists in the affirmation of his own worth and the transcendent worth of unrewarded good. So in a way then, for all their differences in style and manner, the patient Job of the legend and the raging Job of the poetic dialogue are basically the same man. Each ultimately remains firm in his moral character, clinging to righteousness because of its intrinsic value and not because it will be rewarded. Indeed, Job knows bitterly that it will not. At the end of his outburst, Job sues God. He issues him a summons, and he demands that God reveal to him the reason for his suffering. Job pronounces a series of curses to clear himself from the accusations against him, specifying the sins he has not committed, and ending as he began in chapter 3 with a curse on the day of his birth. And we expect to hear from God now, but instead we hear from an unannounced stranger, Elihu. I'm going to have to give Elihu short shrift. He's the only one of the 4 interlocutors to refer to Job by name, address Job by name. He repeats many of the trite assertions of Job's friends. He does hint, however, that not all suffering is punitive. He also hints that contemplation of nature's elements can open the mind to a new awareness of God, and in these 2 respects, Elihu's speech moves us towards God's answer from the storm. So in the climactic moment, God answers Job in an extraordinary theophany or self-manifestation. In chapter 38, God speaks out of the tempest or whirlwind. Who is this who darkens counsel, speaking without knowledge? Is he referring to Job, to Elihu, the 3 friends, all of them? God has heard enough. It's his turn to ask questions, the answers to which are clearly implied. These are rhetorical questions. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Speak if you have understanding. Do you know who fixed its dimensions or who measured it with a line? You did, God. Have you ever commanded the day to break, assigned the dawn its place? Have you penetrated to the sources of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? No, no human has. And God continues with these rhetorical questions regarding the animals, their various powers and attributes. But one wonders what the purpose of all these questions is. One senses that they are irrelevant. Job has posed some very specific challenges to God. Why am I suffering? Is there a pattern to existence? Is God's refusal to answer these challenges a way of saying there is no answer? Or is it God's way of saying that justice is beyond human understanding? Or is this theophany of God in nature, the focus on creation, an implicit assault on the fundamental tenet of Israelite religion that God is known and made manifest through his interactions with humans, his rewards and punishments in historical time? You'll recall that the monotheistic revolution is generally understood to have effected a break from mythological conceptions of the gods as indistinguishable from various natural forces limited by meta-divine powers and forces of the cosmos. The biblical God wasn't another ancient Near Eastern or Canaanite nature god ultimately, but a holy, transcendent power. He was figured this way in many parts of the Bible, known not through the involuntary and recurring cycles of nature, but through his freely willed and non-repeating actions in historical time. Such a view of God underwrites the whole system of divine retributive justice. Only an essentially good God who transcends and is unconstrained by mechanistic natural forces can establish and administer a system of retributive justice, dealing out punishment and reward in response to the actions of humans in time. Is the author of Job suggesting that history and the events that befall the just and the unjust are not the medium of revelation? Is God a God of nature after all, encountered in the repeating cycles of the natural world and not in the unpredictable and incoherent arena of human history and action? If so, then this is a third fundamental biblical assumption that has been radically subverted. So we'll turn now to God's direct speech to Job in 40 verse 8. Would you impugn my justice? Would you condemn me that you be right? And God, I think, is now getting at the heart of the matter. Your friends, Job, were wrong. They condemned you. They attributed sin to you so that they might be right. But you, too, have been wrong, condemning me, attributing wickedness to me, so that you might be right. Job's friends erred because they assumed that there's a system of retributive justice at work in the world, and that assumption led them to infer that all who suffer are sinful, and that's a blatant falsehood. But Job also errs if he assumes that although there isn't a system of retributive justice, there really ought to be one. And it's that assumption that leads him to infer that suffering is the sign of an indifferent or wicked God, and that's equally a falsehood. Job needs to move beyond the anthropocentrism that characterizes the rest of Scripture and the Genesis 1 account of creation, according to which humankind is the goal of the entire process of creation. God's creation, the book of Job seems to suggest, defies such teleological and rational categories. In a nutshell, God refuses to be seen as a moral accountant. The idea of God as a moral accountant is responsible for two major errors: the interpretation of suffering as an indicator of sin, or the ascription of injustice to God. And in his final speech, Job confesses to a new first-hand knowledge of God that he lacked before. And as a result of this knowledge, Job repents. Therefore, I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes, chapter 42, verse 6. And here we see the other meaning of Job's name, one who repents, suddenly leap to the fore. What is he repenting of? Certainly not of sin. God has not upheld the accusations against Job. Indeed, he states explicitly in a moment that the friends were wrong to say he had sinned. But he has indicated that guilt and innocence, reward and punishment, are not what the game is all about. And while Job had long been disabused of the notion that the wicked and the righteous actually get what they deserve, he nevertheless had clung to the idea that ideally they should. And it's that mistaken idea, that idea that led him to ascribe wickedness to God, that Job now recants. With this new understanding of God, Job is liberated from what he would now see as a false expectation raised by the Deuteronomistic notion of a covenant relationship between God and humankind enforced by a system of divine justice. At the end of the story, Job is fully restored to his fortunes. God asserts he did no evil. And the conventional, impeccably Deuteronomistic view of the three friends is clearly denounced by God. He says of them, "They have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." For some, the happy ending seems anticlimactic, a capitulation to the demand for a happy ending of just desserts that runs counter to the whole thrust of the book. And yet, in a way, I think the ending is superbly fitting. It's the last in a series of reversals that subverts our expectations. Suffering comes inexplicably, so does restoration. Blessed be the name of the Lord. God doesn't attempt to justify or explain Job's suffering, and yet somehow by the end of the book, our grumbling, embittered, raging Job is satisfied. Perhaps he's realized that an automatic principle of reward and punishment would make it impossible for humans to do the good for purely disinterested motives. It's precisely when righteousness is seen to be absurd and meaningless that the choice to be righteous paradoxically becomes meaningful. God and Job, however we are to interpret their speeches, are reconciled. The suffering and injustice that characterize the world have baffled humankind for millennia, and the book of Job provides no answer in the sense of an explanation or a justification of suffering and injustice. But what it does offer is a stern warning to avoid the Scylla of blaspheming against the victims by assuming their wickedness, and the Charybdis of blaspheming against God by assuming his. Nor is moral nihilism an option, as our hero, yearning for but ultimately renouncing divine order and justice, clings to his integrity and chooses virtue for nothing.